The man had just gotten home and was about to grab a bite to eat, when his wife immediately fixed him with a steady gaze, as if issuing some kind of invitation. So the two quickly slipped into the car, to spend some intimate time together. But just then, their daughter suddenly appeared outside the car. No matter how much the man scolded her to go away, she kept tugging at the car door regardless. Seeing that his daughter wouldn't give up, the man had no choice but to make a hasty exit through the other side of the car. But before he could recover from the embarrassment, he received an emergency call. He initially thought it was just a routine fire, but to his surprise, the woman of the house was covered in pus-filled sores and bit anyone she saw, and the man who had already died suddenly grabbed his arm. The story took place in Jeollanam-do, South Korea, where the tranquility of a remote mountain village was suddenly shattered by a murder. The cruelty of the crime left the police who arrived at the scene utterly shocked, but what was incomprehensible was that the killer hadn't fled. Instead, he remained seated motionless at the doorway, after a forensic examination confirmed that the victims were a couple who grew ginseng, and that their bodies had been slashed more than 20 times. And upon learning that the bodies had been dragged home after the murder, the police chief realized the killer's motive was not simply murder. He immediately led his team to the victim's farm. When they opened the farm's door, they discovered that this was indeed the primary crime scene, but before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a withered snapdragon caught Goo's eye, looking at the plant, which resembled a skull. He couldn't help but feel curious. Just then, a colleague suddenly shouted that they'd made a new discovery. Goo rushed forward to investigate, only to freeze in his tracks. Inside the back room, not only was there a massive bird's nest, but white candles were arranged all around it. Putting all this together, Bach, his colleague, believed a cult member had infiltrated the village, and that person was most likely the Japanese man who had recently moved in. Rumor had it that someone had witnessed him eating raw venison on the mountain, and transforming into a demon with bloodshot eyes. However, since the coroner detected large amounts of the same toxin in both the victims and the killer's blood, Goo was convinced this was a homicide caused by food poisoning. Little did they know, the moment he finished speaking, the room plunged into darkness. So Bach, as was his habit, began checking the circuit breaker box. Unexpectedly, Goo suddenly screamed in terror and hid himself. When Bach turned around in confusion to investigate, a bizarre, completely naked woman suddenly appeared at the door. Seeing that Goo was utterly terrified, Bach had no choice but to steel himself and go check it out alone. But by then, the woman had vanished without a trace. Even so, Goo couldn't shake the fear in his heart. He couldn't even focus during intimate moments with his wife. Soon after, another murder occurred in the village. A villager's house was suddenly engulfed in flames. Of the family of 3, only the woman survived. But by then, she had completely lost her mind. She bit anyone she saw, and was completely unable to communicate normally. Goo wanted to step in and help, but he was so terrified by the woman's appearance that he could only go through the motions of maintaining order, trying to muddle through the situation. But often, the very thing you fear most is what happens. The man on the stretcher, who was already dead, suddenly grabbed his arm. Caught off guard, Goo collapsed to the ground. His colleagues rushed over to help, but the woman screamed and lunged at him. She grabbed Goo's head and shook it violently. No matter how hard the crowd tugged, they couldn't break free from that eerie grip. By the time they managed to bring the situation under control, Goo had already wet his pants from fear. But before he could even catch his breath, he spotted the Japanese man Bach had mentioned earlier in the crowd.